Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Welcome to a very special, extra long episode of Scary Stories. Thanks to all of you, we are up around 5,000 subscribers. We're grateful for each and every one of you. We've got an interesting mix of stories this time, read by me, PQ Ribber, and Madeline Starr. Or I should say, read by our animated avatars. Without further ado, let's get the show started with an all-new Dogman story. Dogman's Halloween Hangover, as told to Peter Bernard, read by Retribution. When I was a kid, I lived in rural Pennsylvania, not far from the Chestnut Ridge, which is now famous for all those monster sightings. The only monster I ever saw over there, though, was a werewolf-looking thing that I guess must have been Dogman. It was Halloween, so at first I just thought it was an older kid with a really expensive costume. But let me start the story from the beginning. I think it was 1991 or 1992. It was my last year of trick-or-treating, so I must have been 13 or 14, getting too old for it. In fact, this story is kind of the reason I realized I didn't want to do it anymore. I think I was a Ninja Turtle that year. I had a mask I bought in a store, but I created the rest of the costume out of things around the house, and the shell on my back was made of paper mache. I don't think we called it cosplay yet back then. I think it was still just called putting on a costume. I went out with a few other kids on the block, but they had their parents with them and things were getting kinda lame. So at one point or another, I split off from the group and headed away from them toward the richer side of town. I hoped I could get fancier candy over there. No such luck. Only half the houses even opened the door, and then they would give me healthy snacks like an apple or whatever. I felt like throwing the apples through their windows, but cops actually respond when rich people call them, so I decided I'd better not. It seemed like I had a right to pull a trick if I wasn't given a good enough treat, but apparently the law does not care what young trick-or-treaters think is fair. I walked around until my turtle feet were getting tired, and I sat down on a rock at the edge of the woods across the street from some McMansion over there. That's when I heard some rustling in the woods behind me. Before I could even turn around and stand up, a big kid in a werewolf costume was on me, breathing right in my face. His breath was terrible. I backed away quickly, holding my bag of candy behind me. The kid stood up really tall, and I was looking for the zipper in his costume. He wasn't dressed as a werewolf. He wasn't dressed at all. He was covered head to foot in dark fur, like a Bigfoot. But his legs were weird, and his head was like a wolf's head. This was a strange costume. The kid took a step closer to me, and I could see he was just too tall to be a kid. I wondered why a grown man would put on a costume for Halloween. Then he started growling at me. I dropped my candy by accident. I hadn't expected to be growled at. This guy was bonkers, if it was a guy. He dove at me with these immense hand-shaped claws heading straight for me. I screamed, and I ran across the street, hiding behind a hedge in front of the McMansion and peeking back. He wasn't chasing me. He was eating my candy. He was eating my candy. Piece after piece of candy was swallowed whole, packaging and all. This was not a guy in a costume. It was putting food in that long snouted mouth and swallowing. You can't do that with a mask. It had to be a real monster head. And that meant this had to be a real monster. The dog-headed creature pulled out some of the health food and flung it over his shoulder, disgusted. When he got to the apple, he was so annoyed that he took it and flung it over my head back toward the mansion behind me. Crash went a window, and then I could hear an alarm going off. The werewolf got spooked and ran off into the woods with my bag of candy. I ran in the opposite direction toward my home, keeping to the shadows so that I wouldn't be seen. I felt bad that Dogman had broken that window, but I didn't want to get blamed for it. And so I made it home, and my parents asked me what happened to me. They said the parents of the other kids lost me and they were about to call the police. I apologized, and I made up a story that some older kids hassled me and stole my candy. And so that was the last time I ever went trick-or-treating. Nobody questioned me much about it, since I was getting too old for it anyway. But the real reason I quit had nothing to do with that, and everything to do with the Dogman. Don't go away, we've got lots more scary stories right after this.
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary.
Do lightning storms attract Dogman? As told to and read by Peter Bernard. I saw a Dogman once, or a Wolfman, and I'll tell you about it in detail. But I also know 3 other people in my part of the world who have seen him as well, and I'll tell you their stories also. Besides the monster, the only other unifying characteristic of all 4 of our encounters and sightings are that they all occurred during thunderstorms. It's led all 4 of us, as well as members of our friends and families, to get inside when we see storms coming. We live in fear of the weather, but I wonder, is this just a coincidence? Are we being superstitious? Can anyone else back up or debunk this idea for us that you're more likely to confront a Dogman in a lightning storm? Let me start telling you about my friend Fred. He lives just north of Yellow Lake in Wisconsin. He said he was out walking his dog on a dirt path one night near the lake, trying to do their business and get back before the rain fell. All through the walk, he could hear thunder rolling in the distance, getting ever closer. When his dog suddenly froze in place and he almost tripped over her, she started growling at a tree in front of them and to the left of a right bend in the road. Fred assumed it was a squirrel the dog was seeing, but he said as he looked at the tree, he noticed the shadowy figure of a man standing behind it, peeking out at him. There would be no good reason for a person to behave like that, so Fred froze just the same as his dog. He told me that he was about to just turn and walk away But something strange about the figure behind the tree captured his attention, and he became very curious, but couldn't really consciously understand why. He had noticed something was off, but he wasn't sure what. Since he was still about 100 feet or maybe a bit more away from the tree, he hoped he was at a safe distance to stay a few more seconds, watching. According to Fred, now he heard growling from behind the tree that was far deeper than the growling of his dog. Whoever was back there, they stood like a human, but they didn't sound like one. The sky lit up brightly and deafeningly loud thunder crashed down, obviously very close by, immediately bringing a torrent of rain down with it. Suddenly, and very loudly, the figure burst out from behind the tree and revealed itself to be a large wolf standing on its hind legs. It was running at them like a man would, but just as fast as any canine on all fours. Fred's dog yelped and ran away, dragging Fred behind him. He told me the creature should have caught them in just a few seconds, yet he and his dog kept running and running until they made it back to the better traveled and better lit path. Seeing people there and finally feeling safe enough to risk turning around, Fred said there was nothing behind them. He had no idea when the running bipedal wolf stopped running after them, but it must have been a while back. Maybe what he witnessed was a bluff charge, not intended to hurt him, only to intimidate him off the wolf's turf. Some canines get very angry when you look them in the eye, so maybe that was the cause of the bluff attack, if that's what it was. Maybe the loud thunder spooked the beast, but the intense, sudden, driving rain sent him running for shelter? Or maybe, and this is what Fred believes, maybe the creature is born of the lightning and lives only in electrically charged weather. My other friend, Anne, used to live in the northern part of Webster, Wisconsin, just to the southwest of Devil's Lake. Her neighborhood was heavily forested, and she used to go for walks through the woods on the weekends. She would bring a book. I mean, a real book made of paper, since this happened back in the 1990s. And she'd find a field to sit in or a tree to sit under and then get lost in her book. She would usually start wandering home when the light began to get too dark to read in. Anne loved the forest back then, viewing it as almost her personal friend. She felt she had a deep relationship with nature and that she was safe when she was surrounded by trees. She doesn't feel that way any longer. One day, the last day Anne would ever read in the forest, began as sunny and comfortable. She hadn't checked the weather, or she would have known there was a good chance for thunderstorms later in the afternoon. She nodded off under a tree, waking up suddenly as thunder loudly crashed and reverberated through the forest. Nothing like a loud noise to wake you from your sleep. Before she could get up to go, the floodgates opened and rain flooded down all over her. She started running for home, getting drenched in the process, since she wasn't dressed for the weather. Racing through the trees and foliage with her head down, Anne didn't see what was in front of her until it was too late. The way she described it to me was like this. She was watching the ground in front of her as she ran, hoping not to slip or slide, as the ground was getting wet very rapidly, and footing was not good. Suddenly, on the ground in front of her, the hind feet of a large animal came into view a second before she was about to run into the creature. According to Anne, her heart froze up for more reasons than just the idea of running into something that might be hostile or violent. The fact that this creature, which had paws, not feet on the bottom holding it up, had to be standing upright like a human, made no sense to her whatsoever. She should have seen the front paws first, not the hind paws. Anne's days as a softball player in college came in handy as she allowed her top half to fall backwards as her legs moved ahead of her, and she literally slid like a baseball player through and under the legs of the creature, getting herself covered in mud all over her back in the process. She slid face up and got the world's most unique view ever of an animal that she described as a wolf man. Anne slid right into a rock embedded in the mud and righted herself, again using her softball instincts. The jolt knocked the book from her hands, but she just resumed running, not looking back until she had gained some steam. Unlike the story Fred tells, Anne says she saw it running after her and heard it snarling and barking behind her. She ran until every part of her ached, yet she could still hear the sound of the creature panting and racing behind her. Running madly, she had no idea where she was heading until she tripped and rolled down a small hill, landing on the pavement of a parking lot. Winded but uninjured, she looked up and saw the wolfman creature standing on top of the hill, but no longer chasing her. It wasn't looking down at her at all. Instead, it was staring off in the distance. Looking in that direction to see what the creature was seeing, Anne noticed a family running from a building toward their car in the lot, which was in her direction. So Anne says she laid on her back on the pavement in the rain and watched as the creature slowly backed up into the woods, then went off in some direction she couldn't see. Her description of the monster was a bit more detailed and graphic than you would want me to tell you here, but let's just say she was certain that she was viewing a male and that it was definitely a real animal, not something she was imagining or hallucinating, and not a ghost or phantom or projection. This creature was also gray, like the one Fred had seen, but she described it as dark gray and thoroughly drenched from the storm. She didn't sense any human intelligence from it, but she did sense a strong feeling of evil. In Anne's opinion, the animal is real and lives in the deeper parts of the forest, but she thinks that when thunderstorms are approaching, the creature for some reason moves out toward where human beings live and probably poses a real threat to us, but only during those times. She says the air tasted like metal that afternoon and that she could feel the electric charge in the air. That charge, she feels, somehow attracts the dogmen to come visit us in our neighborhoods. Although she hasn't lived in Wisconsin for over 5 years now, Anne still, to this day, refuses to go out in thunderstorms, or even when the weather says there might be thunderstorms. Next, I'd like to tell you about my Uncle Terry's story. This was in the late 1970s, and he was a teenager. He and his friends were hanging out at Mud Lake up in Oakland. I forget if he said they were fishing or swimming or what it was. I don't remember if there's even any fishing up there, so maybe they were just skipping rocks. At any rate, a thunderstorm came on them really quickly. And they were going to leave, except they saw a lightning bolt crack down straight into the center of the lake. And this was just too exciting for them to want to leave. According to Uncle Terry, they saw 2 more lightning bolts hit the water itself. I always questioned him about this when I was a kid. Lightning isn't supposed to strike in the same place twice. And I wasn't sure if lightning was ever going to strike a lake, was it? I've long since learned that this happens quite frequently. In fact, it's one of my favorite kinds of videos to search for on the internet. So anyway, my uncle and his teenage buddies were huddled together under a tree, getting rained on, but amazed by the lightning show they were witnessing. Then came the truly unbelievable part of this story. Uncle Terry said one of his buddies started screaming that a monster was coming out of the lake. Sure enough, walking out of the water as though this were a natural thing to do was a dog-headed man covered in striped fur of varying shades of dark gray. Uncle Terry said the thing walked upright like a man, and it was a stunning-looking creature. It appeared every bit as beautiful as any wolf you might see in the wild, but larger, upright like a man, and apparently able to live underwater even during a thunderstorm. Uncle Terry and his friends might not have been scared off by the rain, and not even by the lightning striking the lake repeatedly, but they were certainly frightened off by the Dogman. To his dying day, my uncle told that story as being the scariest thing he ever saw. Since he worked for years after that as an EMS worker in an ambulance, I imagine that Dogman must have truly scared him that day. Was it just the appearance of a large, unexpected predator? Or is there something about these werewolves we saw that makes them more frightening to humans? Is it an aspect of them or a power or ability they possess? Why would even a brave man like my Uncle Terry, who once rescued people from a live gunfight, find Dogmen the scariest thing they had ever encountered? Which brings me to my encounter, which has left me traumatized. It's horrifying to think of it, and painful to write it down. That's why I started with the other stories. I've been trying to warm myself up and brace myself for finally getting this all out. I don't actually know how much of what I'm about to tell you really took place, and how much of it was inserted into my mind, because I think that whatever happened to me involved infrasound, or the use of vibrations unhealthy to human beings. It's possible that at least some of this was hallucinated, but it felt more like everything was being broadcast into my brain, or else maybe it was actually occurring in front of me, but in a hyper-real way. I was taking a shortcut through the woods near me, and I don't want to get too specific with where this took place, since I still live in the same house. Anyway, I was walking home and I heard thunder rumbling in the distance. I didn't speed up though, because I had grown up loving thunder and lightning. I never felt threatened of it. I only saw it from a distance and thought it was exciting and beautiful. So I wandered home, listening to the thunder in the distance approaching and enjoying that feeling of the air becoming electric. So I approached the edge of the woods, which is the edge of my property in the rear. Just before exiting the trees, just before my house would have come into view, I felt a terrible feeling of foreboding. Like I wasn't gonna like what I saw when I entered the clearing. The forest around me seemed more alive than I'd ever noticed it was before. Everything came into the clearest of views. I've been nearsighted since I was a kid, but rarely wear my glasses. That afternoon, as the thunderstorm gathered overhead, I could see everything around me with crystal clarity. It was better than high definition and more 3D than Captain EO. I felt both terrified and elated simultaneously. I shook all over as I parted some branches and walked onto my property. Thunder cracked loudly, clearly very close by at the moment I arrived home, just like in an old black and white scary movie. Looking ahead of me, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing right in front of the back door to my house, was a monster. There was a dog-headed man there, just standing there. I could see every single hair on him move in the breeze and the rain. It was a very strange experience, not feeling like a fantasy at all, but instead seeming more real than anything had ever seemed prior. It was like my entire life had been a dress rehearsal for meeting this great being in front of me. I was consumed and overwhelmed with the gut feeling that now everything made perfect sense. Life had seemed a mystery before, but now everything had been revealed to me. I have no idea now, looking back on it, why seeing a terrifying walking dog monster would give me this elated feeling, except that I was being sort of drugged by the sounds surrounding us. I had first noticed he was growling at me. Then I wasn't sure if it was a growl, or even if it was coming from him. I next heard running water, which was the most beautiful sounding thing I'd ever heard. I felt like anything I could hear, I could also see and touch, and that this was the way it was supposed to be. Then, I remembered. There are no running streams or rivers close enough to my house for me to be hearing water. Obligingly, the sound turned itself to swirling winds. I stared up at the hot sun burning down from the sky. Where had the rain gone? The sun was so hot that it seemed to dry me off in a minute or two. Then it got hotter and hotter, too hot to bear. Soon I felt as drenched as I had during the rainstorm, only now from my own sweat. I felt parched, then more extremely dehydrated. I became confused and wondered where I was. That's when I noticed the wolf-headed man again, standing there by by my back door, staring at me, growling. He was causing all of this. Maybe it was real, maybe it wasn't, but either way, he was the one causing all this. I tried to articulate this concept to him, but I found I couldn't speak. The wolf-headed, hairy man seemed to grin from ear to ear as it took a few incredibly long steps in my direction and was almost instantly right in my face. I screamed, and then my wife was there shaking me. I looked around and I was in my bedroom, standing on my bed, drenched in water and not wearing any clothes. She told me I'd been screaming and asked me what I was on. It took me a few days to start to try to explain the story to her, but she was having none of it, and I've still to this day never really explained it to her. She told me she didn't want to know. She just wanted me to make sure it never happened again. But I can't do that. I didn't do anything to make it happen last time. She found my clothes folded up neatly at the edge of our backyard. I don't remember taking them off, but it must have happened during the infrasound episode or whatever that was. My 3 friends are all convinced that they saw something that looked like a wolf-headed Sasquatch but with dog legs, not Bigfoot legs. I saw what seems to be exactly the same creature, and yet I have no idea if what I saw really looked like that or not. Maybe it was some other kind of creature, or maybe it was even a human with an infrasound device, or some kind of device able to produce the effects I've described. Maybe it affects each person differently, and that's why we each had experiences that didn't exactly match each other. But I don't rule out the possibility that the creature or entity looks exactly like what I saw. Either way, it has some kind of ability to somehow mess with our consciousness. And in my opinion, that must be the reason it seems so much more frightening than anything else I or my friends have ever experienced. What kind of animal can induce fear from a distance? And since all 4 of us were not killed and devoured by the Dogman, it must have some other reason for using this ability than hunting. Maybe it feeds off our fear? I know that sounds bizarre, but what about this story hasn't been bizarre? I've read a lot about the Dogman and werewolf sightings around Wisconsin, and most people do not see what I or my friends and family saw. We probably saw a wolf man and not a dog man. It really did look just like a wolf that some 3D animator had made stand up and walk around. It looked as much like a wolf as an upright walking creature could look without being a canine down on all 4s. Since lightning rarely, if ever, seems to play a role in most Dogman stories, maybe what we all saw was something other than that. Maybe it was a supernatural or interdimensional creature, and it needs the lightning storms to emerge into our reality. Unless it was just a coincidence that all 4 of us saw the creature in lightning storms. It does seem that is a major part of why this entity was encountered by each of us. I've spent years thinking hard about it, but to this day, I still can't decide if lightning storms attract the Dogman.
I
felt sorry for myself because I had no doorman. But then I met a man who had no scary stories, psychic Bigfoot versus savage Bigfoot paraphernalia. Did you know you could be wearing a psychic Bigfoot versus savage Bigfoot t-shirt right now? They come in white, black colors, long sleeve, short sleeve, little baby red sleeve, wife beater size, pregnant wife size. Plus, you can own a scary story, psychic Bigfoot versus savage Bigfoot hat, hoodie, journal, postcards, wall decals. All this can be yours right now by going to cafepress.com/scarystoriesnyc. Link is in the description.
The Bigfoot of the Bronx is told to Peter Bernard, read by P.Q. Ribber. My grandmother grew up in the Bronx back in the 1930s and 40s on a farm, believe it or not. She told me the small farmhouse she was born and grew up in was the only one on the block in those days, and that a tributary of the Bronx River ran through the farm in the back. They did not have running water, and it was her job as a kid to go get water from the river and bring it into the house. The bathroom was an outhouse. They didn't have a refrigerator, but they did have an ice box, which was basically just a box with a big chunk of ice under it or over it, or something that you could keep stuff cold in. I'm not sure how it worked. She had a regular refrigerator by the time I was in the picture. Grandma told me that other than going to school, she virtually never left the farm when she was young, as they had most of their essentials delivered. Milk came delivered before she woke up every morning. The iceman delivered ice. The fruit man pushed his fruit cart down the block daily. And there even was a man who came at least once a week with a cart to sharpen scissors and knives. So in the summer, her life was basically to get up at dawn, milk the cow and goat, feed the chickens, and tend the crops. After dinner, she was allowed to listen to 1 half-hour radio program. Then it was time for bed, and the whole process began again the next day. She told me this information over and over as I grew up, usually following it with a lecture about how easy my generation had it by comparison. I would put up with these boring stories because every so often she'd trot out her good story, the one about the wild man. That was a story I could not hear enough of, and I would never tire of. Story always started with Grandma talking about how one night in the early 40s, she woke up to the sound of a rifle being fired right outside her bedroom window. Rushing out of the house, she found her father holding his smoking rifle, staring into the forest behind the farm, ranting in German about a man trying to steal their chickens. Grandma noticed the chicken coop was in fact broken into, and she immediately set about nailing a board over the hole that the chickens were trotting out of. After repairs, she and her dad counted heads and discovered the one chicken was missing. The next night, Grandma slept straight through, but when she got up, she found the chicken coop broken into again, and all but 2 hens and the rooster were completely gone. She woke up her dad, who had also slept through the entire incident, and was angry about it. Her mom was too ill to help them, so Grandma and her dad started taking daytime naps when they could, and took turns at night standing watch over the farm with the rifle at their side. Nothing happened for almost a week. Then the man came back, this time for their goat. Grandma says she was sitting on the back porch on her watch when she must have dozed off because the sound of the goat bleating woke her from her slumber. It was not bleating as though we were frightened. It was bleating the sound it made when welcoming one of the family. Assuming her dad was up, she began apologizing for having nodded off and semi-stumbled in her exhausted state toward the goat. She noticed that her dad was untying the animal, and she started asking him why he was doing that when her thoughts were interrupted by the loudest scream she said she had ever heard in her life. It was a roar, a bellow, and a scream, all rolled into one. The sound was so forceful that it felt like someone had punched her in the chest, and she took a step backwards, almost falling down from the sheer power of it. That set the goat to screaming in fright, and the chickens and dogs and half the forest animals as well. Staring at the figure she now realized was not her dad, she tried to focus her eyes and comprehend what was standing before her. It did look like a man, but a very tall one, and he was naked too. I was a big fan of Leonard Nimoy's In Search Of, and so I would try to get Grandma to admit she'd seen Bigfoot. She, on the other hand, preferred to refer to it as a him, and in her mind, he was a caveman of some sort. I showed her drawings of Bigfoot, but she said this was not a monkey. He was not covered in fur, he was covered in hair, and to her there was a major difference between the two. She said it was dark, and she really couldn't make out the face too well. But she, at the time, did not think at all of apes or gorillas. She thought she was face to face with a giant caveman, and she was terrified. Deciding she was no threat, the hairy man took the leash of the goat and turned to walk into the forest with it. Realizing her family could not afford to lose that goat is what Grandma says gave her the courage to fire her rifle just over the man's head. She said he was so immense that she didn't think a rifle shot would take him down, so she hoped the sound would scare him off instead. It worked. He dropped the goat leash and returned to the forest in a hurry, making very little noise. Her father had been awakened by the noise and got outside just in time to see the tall man disappear into the woods. The next day, her dad brought a large supply of barbed wire and metal fencing, and the two of them spent the day fencing in their entire property. She claimed her dad hooked up a gas-powered motor to a Rube Goldberg device he had built himself so that at night the fence was electrically charged. It made a terrible racket, cost too much in terms of gas to power the engine, and succeeded only in electrocuting 2 squirrels and a bird. They turned off the engine for good after the 4th night, but the giant caveman that I think was really Bigfoot never came back. I've searched on Google, and as far as I can tell, this is the first, last, and only report of a Bigfoot-type creature in the Bronx, and it happened within the last 100 years. Determined to find Bigfoot bones, all through my childhood I would spend summer days at my grandma's house digging up holes in her backyard while she watched her soap operas. I dug up a musket ball one time, which showed that her yard had either been a hunting ground or the site of a battle. On other occasions I discovered a dragonfly fossilized in shale and impressions of an ancient fern plant in a stone. I never discovered even chicken bones, let alone Bigfoot bones, but each dig was the most exciting adventure of my life. Knowing I was investigating an area that Bigfoot had once called home, or at least migrated through, made every second last 10 minutes for me and every color and scent brighter and sharper. I've never seen a Bigfoot or really anything strange at all in my entire life, but in my mind I relived my grandma's harrowing tale over and over as though I'd been there myself. I would stand there where she stood and imagine the giant hairy man was still there before me, standing where she said he stood. In the 1990s, Grandma died, and my parents sold her house to a family who I told Grandma's Bigfoot stories to, as well as my stories of things I had dug up back there. They were unimpressed and quickly paved over the backyard, covering the entire former farm, and erected a basketball court over it. No idea who owns it now, but I doubt they have any idea of the adventures that took place on that property back in the old days when people still had a direct connection to the land. I'm sure they have no idea at all that they live on the very spot where Bigfoot was once seen, in the Bronx. Back in a sec with another scary story.
Did you know you can become a Scary Stories NYC paid subscriber for as little as $3 a month and get to hear secret scary stories that the public never gets to hear? It's true. Go to peterbernard.com to find out more.
The Hate Maker, read by Madeline Starr. My dad was in the Iraq War in the Army. I was 12 when he came back in 2011 and brought us home some odd souvenirs. A lamp that looked like a genie lamp turned out to be neither magical nor valuable when we got it appraised. My mom was kind of unhappy that he gave my little brother spent shells from various weapons. But it's not like they could harm anyone, so she let him keep them. The bong candy was, shall we say, enlightening. That went fast. But the present he brought back for me was the weirdest thing I had ever seen in my life. It was a carving of a face with the hugest freaking eyes you could ever imagine. Like space alien eyes, but not all black. It had a weird expression on his face, and I found it terrifying to be around. Dad explained that it's not a he, it's a she. He said that males of that era were usually sculpted with long beards. He also told me that the face used to be part of a statue that was left in a temple to pray to the god or goddess on behalf of the person who brought the statue. So, he reasoned that it must be good luck, and he hung it directly over the head of my bed. This freaky, scary thing that I never wanted to be near was now directly over my head as I tried to get to sleep at night. Just staring forward over me, looking oddly surprised or afraid. I tried to drop hints that maybe Daddy should put it over his bed instead, because I loved him and I wanted all the good luck to go to him. He could tell I didn't like it, and he got very hurt. He explained that it's a priceless item not even known about by anthropologists or archaeologists, and that he had violated the laws of at least 2 countries by smuggling it home to me. He asked if he would have done that if it were a bad thing, and I said no. I had to say no. But now I knew it should really be studied by scientists. I felt much more strongly that hanging it over my bed was a bad thing. Meanwhile, throughout this conversation, the face kept staring at me with its insane and frightened-looking eyes. That night, I dreamed that I was in the desert and there was nothing but sand in any direction I looked. Then I saw a woman dancing. She was whirling in place and waving her arms up and down at her side. I began walking toward her. The closer I got, the more detail I could make out. She was surrounded by men, holding what I first took to be rifles, then realized were swords. I walked directly up to one of the men and tried to speak to him, but no sound came out of my throat. I looked at him so I could try to signal him with my hands, but I could see he had no face. I turned to look at the dancing woman, but she wasn't a woman at all. She, or it, was actually a number of writhing snakes, all intertwined. Together they formed the shape of a dancing woman by squirming and swirling around over and over. Each snake had huge eyes, like the face over my bed. One lashed out to bite me, and I woke up suddenly, shaking my bed violently in the process. The face fell off the wall, hitting me hard on the back of the head. That continued to hurt for around another week. Dad's response? He just promised he'd reinstall the face more securely, making it impossible to knock down no matter how hard the wall got shaken. Gee, thanks for missing the point, Dad. No matter how hard I begged, Daddy would not humor me about my dream. He called me his little drama princess and told me to be good. Then Mom drove me to school. She feigned interest when I told her the story again, but I could tell that nobody was going to be able to appreciate how shaken up I'd become over my strange dream. I felt really not listened to, which led me to find other things to do after school besides going home. I began sleeping over at my friends' places as much as their parents could stand, but I still had to sleep with the face 4 nights out of 7 most of the time. Every time I saw it, I was reminded that nobody cared about my feelings, and that I really didn't matter to the people I had loved the most of my life. I started listening to different kinds of music that allowed me to get out my anger and sadness by singing along to. I made new friends, and we all began to experiment with more adult ways to entertain ourselves. Probably a few years before we should have been attracted to that sort of thing. My parents began to notice these changes, and I was soon disabused of the notion that they didn't care what I did. They most certainly did care, and they hated every part of who they saw me becoming. So now, I went from feeling that I didn't matter to the people I loved to understanding that the people I loved hated everything about me. After one particularly cruel moment from my mom in my room one night, my old piggy bank just flew off of my dresser and crashed into the wall, missing my mom's head by about a foot and completely freaking all of us out. Pennies, dimes, and nickels were everywhere, and my mom had bits of clay and dust all over her face and in her hair. The good part about that weird occurrence is that for a day or two, the conversation about me stopped and was replaced by my parents being convinced we had a poltergeist. That soon ended when they happened upon the theory that young girls turning into women cause poltergeist occurrences by themselves. That threw them into paranoia about me, and they accused me of being into witchcraft or devil worship, or whatever they could think of. They didn't know anything about any of that stuff except what they'd see in the movies and on Netflix, which only made them more frightened. Frightened people are no fun to be around, and frightened people convinced that you're out to hurt them are the worst people to be around. That is what the two people I loved most in the world had become, and they blamed me for it. I remember one night after my dad asked me if I was on drugs, his stupid picture of some old sports jerk flew off the wall and smashed. A piece of glass went into my brother's eye, and my dad had to drive him to the hospital. He was fine, but he almost lost eyesight in one eye. Yet, even that wouldn't wake my parents up from their spell of fear and nastiness. One night, after being screamed at and humiliated, I lay on my bed crying, and my little brother came in. "It's because of that ugly face, you know." I stopped crying long enough to look at him quizzically. "All of this," he said, motioning to the big, ugly-eyed, frightening-looking thing on my wall, "if we get rid of that, we can have our parents back." After he said that, a flood of emotion escaped from me. It was the first time someone was telling me that everything wasn't my fault since Dad had come home. Even though he had a patch over one eye, while his eye healed, my brother had a clearer vision at that moment than anyone else in the family. We had to wait till Saturday when both our parents were preoccupied, but he and I managed to Google museums and find one that would accept donations of artifacts. We packaged up both the Face of Doom and the used weaponry Dad had given my brother and mailed it off to the scientists. When my parents found out, actually they took it in stride and asked us to tell them first before we did something like that again. Dad told us he was proud that we thought more of helping advance scientific study than we thought of being in possession of valuable artifacts. This was my old dad, finally back from the war. All of the problems were somehow being caused by the things Dad brought back. These days, I'm in high school and I'm starting to look around at colleges. Dad and Mom have been a lot less lame about everything, and I have gone back to trusting both of them with my innermost thoughts and feelings. Some of my closest friends are having a terrible time with their families, and I wish all of their problems could be as easy to fix as our family's problem was. Maybe in a sense, they can be. Whatever problem a family can have other than health is really a problem of them reacting to a crisis with fear instead of love. As corny as that is, it's true. It's fun to be scared with a scary story, but if you're living your life like you're in a creepypasta, then you can't expect any sort of happy ending. And that is the happy ending to my story.
In the description of this video, we've got a link to our new Scary Stories t-shirt. It's our classic skull logo, and it says Scary Stories underneath in the kaiju monster font. It comes in black and also black and other dark colors, such as black. Good for ladies or gentlemen, hoodies too, whatever you need.
Alligator Sewer Swarm, as told to Peter Bernard, read by BQ River. Growing up in the Bronx, I heard a lot of urban legends. I knew which fast food chicken chain was supposedly putting poison in their food to sterilize Bronx men. I knew which apartments and which buildings had ghosts and which ones had rats. They both make similar noises, and it pays to know which is which. There was one urban legend, though, that I know for a fact was true because my dad was a photographer for the Daily News back then, and he showed me actual photos of what I'm about to describe. Like I said, I'll describe the photos because I can't show them to you. Why? Well, not only did those photos never get published, but my father was ordered to destroy the negatives. He didn't, of course. Unfortunately, someone else in his office stole them when he wasn't there one day, so in all likelihood they don't even exist any longer. I'll explain why I think that happened too. But first let me tell you the story. Okay. The way this started for me was my father came home one night, really stressed out and babbling that there were alligators in the Bronx. He was on his third drink before he started making any sense at all. It seems Dad had been sent out with a reporter, whose name I knew back then but have forgotten since, to cover the story of a murder in the Bronx. Dad in those days took a lot of pictures of dead bodies, and he had gotten kind of cold and hard about it. That's why it was so surprising to see him this upset about a story. When Dad and the reporter got to the place, it was already taped off, and he said he had to use misdirection to even get into the apartment, which had already been declared off limits to the press and public. He said the body was in the bathtub. As he snapped pictures, his reporter entered and started whispering to him so the cops didn't notice him there. He told him to climb on top of the tub and get a shot of the body from as directly above as possible. My dad did and got his shot, but then one of his feet slipped and it came down hard inside the tub. It turns out the tub bottom itself had been rotting away or being eaten away from underneath and was so thin that Dad's foot went straight through it, punching a big hole that enlarged the drain to 3 or 4 times the size it had been earlier. Dad said it felt like he stepped in molasses and something was trying to suck his foot downward, so he pulled his leg back as quickly as he could and flung himself onto the bathroom floor, knocking his reporter partner backwards on his butt in the process, with my dad landing on top of him. The sound of the hole being opened up, coupled with Dad's surprised scream, alerted some of the cops to their presence. They came over to throw the two of them out just as a swarm of small creatures surged out of the hole and over the edge of the tub, heading directly toward them. Dad and his reporter ran straight into the cops, and all of them crashed to the floor together. The small animals swarmed onto their legs, and Dad showed us the pictures he took during the swarming. They looked like alligators, but tiny ones. There were pictures of the men pulling the little monsters off my father, who was apparently too busy chronicling the moment to save himself. He showed us contact sheets with dozens and dozens of photos of this event. Dad told us how the city wanted to play this story down to prevent panic and had asked the news to kill the pictures. He was so furious about his editor siding with the city officials and canceling the story that he said he had already personally contacted 2 book publishers about putting out a book about the occurrence, using his photos to sell them on the idea. Dad had always been a very motivated guy, but the shock of what he had gone through clearly changed him, and there was a fire in his eyes I had never seen before. In some of the photos, the animals were so small that they just looked like black smudges in the pictures. I asked Dad about that. He said some of them were so small they looked roach-sized, and some were smaller than that, all the way down to fruit fly size. On the other hand, some of them were as large as a rat or small cat. They existed all different sizes in between, and there seemed to be an endless supply of them. He got thrown out of the premises and told to keep his trap shut about it if he didn't want to get arrested for illegal trespass. I asked Dad how the hell alligators could be the size of roaches or rats, and he had clearly already been thinking about it because he gave a long explanation of his theory that they had evolved to become tinier in order to better survive in our sewers. His theory was based on the premise that people had flushed baby alligator pets down the toilet when they got too large, and that some had survived in the sewers and interbred. Since their large size, an advantage in the swamps and jungles, would become a disadvantage in the confined spaces underneath the Bronx, the gators had become tinier each generation. My dad wasn't a scientist, but that was his theory, and I'm passing it along because I don't have a better one. Anyway, like I said, someone disappeared the photos and negatives from my dad's office. I'd guess it was most likely someone from the city or someone within the news organization working at the behest of the city. My dad kept his ear to the ground about this story, in a figurative sense I mean, for years, and he never found out anything about a second mini alligator attack. After a decade or so, we all figured the city must have gone in and wiped all the gators out of the sewer and just kept the whole thing quiet. Clearly, the controversy has passed, and the mini alligator swarm was nipped in the bud. My dad has been dead nearly 7 years now, and probably all the people involved in the original story have passed on as well. If anyone reading or listening to this story knows anything about the whereabouts of my father's original photographs, please contact me via whatever social media you're getting this information from. I would give anything to see those Ratigator photos again.
Check out the audio podcast version of Scary Stories NYC, now available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and other popular podcatchers. Bigfoot Attacked My Tiny House. Scary Stories by Peter Bernard, Volume 1, now available on Amazon.
Come back for more scary stories.